Professor Michael Wesley, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor International at the University of Melbourne. Professor Wesley, thanks for your time. Let's turn our attention first of all to Penny Wong's visit to Samoa, then to Tonga, follows on from her visit last week to Fiji. And at the same time, we saw China shelve that plan for a region-wide deal. Any link between the two, and what do you make of Penny Wong and Albanese's foreign policy in the first fortnight?
Well, you could say it's a pretty frenetic start to foreign policy, but understandably so. I think Wang Yi's tour of the Pacific has certainly got alarm bells ringing, not only in Canberra, but in Wellington and Washington and elsewhere as well. I think it's really quite significant that the Pacific wasn't able to achieve consensus on the Chinese plan. I would be very surprised if into the future there was Pacific consensus around such a far-reaching plan from China. What we do know is that there is quite significant differences among Pacific Island governments that, despite calling themselves the Pacific family, Pacific Island countries are quite diverse. They have very different political systems, and they have very different views of the outside world. And so I think finding consensus among Pacific Island countries about forming relationships as a collective with a country as contentious as China is going to be a very big ask.
We've seen the reaction to the New Zealand statement with Joe Biden, a swift rebuke. Any reset from the Australian government at the moment, it still looks like there's going to be some choppy waters ahead, because obviously there will be statements made of that sort when Mr Albanese goes to Washington and so on. So what's your read on the whole relationship as we start a new era, really, between at least the Albanese government and Beijing? Do you expect it to be any more promising?
Look, time will tell, Kieran. Certainly the Chinese, from the embassy in Canberra to obviously the Premier's message just after the election, show that they have an appetite for a bit of a rapprochement. But obviously that hasn't stopped them sending Wang Yi into the Pacific, and despite the concerns of Australia. And as Anthony Albanese said, you know, those trade sanctions remain there. We should also remember, Kieran, that when Scott Morrison took over from Malcolm Turnbull, China then at that stage saw that as an opportunity for a bit of a reset and sent some conciliatory messages as well. So I think what we could probably say is that there will be a period of Chinese receptiveness to some form of rapprochement between Australia and China. But if that isn't taken up by the Labor government, then we will probably lapse back into the same sort of kind of tense, cold, frozen relationship that we saw between the Morrison government and Beijing. I think that Labor is being very cautious here. They realise that while Australia could definitely benefit from a more stable, more pragmatic set of relationships with Beijing, they're worried, I think, about being seen not only domestically, but I think also by the United States and others as starting to toe a different line on China and to be quote unquote softer on China. And I don't think they want to be painted into that picture.
One of the relationships that's pivotal to Australia dealing with the more aggressive and assertive China has to be Indonesia. It's our northern neighbour, the vast archipelago to our north, and the Prime Minister has it as a top priority to get there. He's leaving for Jakarta on Sunday.
Yeah, and look, this goes into a long tradition in Australian foreign policy. New governments, new prime ministers tend to make Jakarta their first port of call. Often this is not backed up with any sort of consistent engagement of Indonesia. I think you'd have to go probably back to Paul Keating to find a prime minister who really did prioritise the Australia-Indonesia relationship. So I think it's good that the Prime Minister is heading to Jakarta so early in his tenure as Prime Minister. But I think what needs to be done is to find a really meaningful program of engagement with Indonesia that works in both Australia's and Indonesia's interests. And most importantly, I think, Kieran, Australia and Indonesia tend to get on best when they're working together on a collective project in the region. We need to find what that project is, and we need to come together with Indonesia and build a really strong relationship with Indonesia over the next decade and beyond.
Well, I've got less than a minute now, but when you talk about a collective project, can you give us a sense of what you're thinking?
Yeah, so a couple of examples. One was the partnership between Keating and Suharto around the APEC Leaders Summits back in the early 1990s. Indonesia was a big supporter of that idea and helped get it up in the region. Then later in John Howard's tenure, Australia and Indonesia collaborated around the Bali process, around asylum seeker arrivals, and then around terrorism and radicalisation. Two examples of where two very different countries can come together and work on a common endeavour.
Professor Michael Wesley, Deputy Vice-Chancellor International at the University of Melbourne, thank you